But it was really kind of at this key juncture when my oldest daughter was actually diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And as a parent, it kind of rocks your world. And so for me, it kind of got to the point where I started thinking, okay, if I'm going to dedicate my life to science, I want it to be something that I'm passionate about. And I want it to be something that I'm, really feel is going to be contributing to the world. And so I made a decision then to kind of make a pivot in my career to move towards diabetes research and looking for ways to develop therapies and cures for type 1 diabetes.
Welcome to the DNA of Things. Today we sit down with Dr. Quinn Peterson, a stem cell biologist at the Mayo Clinic. Dr. Quinn's journey is a powerful example of how a personal catalyst, that is, his daughter's type 1 diabetes diagnosis, transformed his career from cancer drug discovery to seeking a biological cure. Now spearheading Islet Regeneration at the Mayo Clinic, developing transplantable cells to restore insulin independence. Quick disclaimer here, the views and opinions expressed by Dr. Peterson are his own and do not necessarily reflect the official positions or policies of the Mayo Clinic. We explore in this episode the shift from managing symptoms to engineering living systems that behave like native human tissue, from dad in the wild realizations to the frontier of 3D islet organoids. Let's step into the lab with Dr. Quinn Peterson. Dr. Quinn P. Peterson is a stem cell biologist and biomedical engineer at the Mayo Clinic, whose work sits at the frontier of regenerative medicine and diabetes care. As part of the Islet Regeneration program, he leads efforts to create functional transplantable pancreatic islets from pluripotent stem cells, work that could fundamentally change how type 1 diabetes is treated. Now, rather than managing symptoms, Dr. Peterson's research aims to restore lost biological function by engineering living systems that behave like native human tissue. What makes his work especially compelling is its personal origin, motivated by family experience with type 1 diabetes. Dr. Peterson brings both scientific rigor and human urgency to his research. His lab integrates genetics, cellular environments, and tissue engineering to unlock latent regenerative potential. Dr. Quinn P. Peterson, welcome to the DNA of Things.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, let's start at the beginning, as we had, kind of been touching on just at the beginning of our discussion before we hit record, let's say, is well, you do have a very personal origin story here. And so how did you come to, well, first I'd like to understand, well, how did you come to choose, your path in the sciences? Because, that's always interesting. But then how did you end up at the Mayo Clinic doing what you're doing specifically with type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, area to think about. It's always fun for me to kind of think back to how I got to where I am now, right? I've always been very interested in the sciences. I think as a child, that's just kind of the way that my brain worked, is trying to understand how things work. Simple things from, taking apart old vacuums that were at our house, or, trying to just really understand the things around me. So I think that's always been a little bit kind of hardwired into the way that I think. But really, when I was, I think it was really when I was in high school that I started really to seriously start thinking about, pursuing science for my career and throughout my life. And I really enjoyed the classes that I took in high school. I also have an older brother who has tread this path before me. And so, seeing him and what he was doing, I just got really excited about the potential to be able to make impacts in the world by understanding deeper the world that we live in. So that's what I did. I went to school and got 2 degrees in biochemistry. I got a bachelor's degree and a PhD in biochemistry. And really, it was during my PhD, I was doing very different research, up until this kind of critical point, which you alluded to. So in my undergrad, I was doing a lot of work on identifying contaminants in drinking water and how do we actually, kind of measure those contaminants so that we can find remediation strategies. And then subsequently, during my PhD, was really working on developing a new chemotherapeutic drug that was able to target a kind of a unique pathway in cancer to be able to address cancer, and really enjoyed that work, right? That's been very fulfilling. That drug is now in clinical trials, and I'm excited to see that moving forward. But it was really kind of at this key juncture when my oldest daughter was actually diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And as a parent, that kind of rocks your world. And so for me, it kind of got to the point where I started thinking, okay, if I'm going to dedicate my life to science, I want it to be something that I'm passionate about, and I want it to be something that I'm, really feel is going to be contributing to the world. And so made a decision then to kind of make a pivot in my career to move towards diabetes research and looking for ways to develop therapies and cures for type 1 diabetes. And so subsequently spent my postdoctoral training at Harvard University with one of the key leaders in this space, Doug Melton, and really credit Doug for providing the opportunity for me to get trained in this diabetes space and to really launch the areas that we're exploring now.
And so, how old is your daughter now?
She's 19 now. She's a sophomore in college right now. So,
Okay.
and
So
subsequently, sorry, Jeremy. Subsequently, two of my other children have actually also been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So that's really, I think, reinforced that decision of my passion, and really something that I am grateful for is that I'm able to contribute in this space, and not just for my own kids, but for all those who struggle with this disease. And so that's been really gratifying to me, as I continue forward in this space.
Well, there's something to be said for pairing like I mean, it's an emotional drive with the logical or the reason, the endeavor to reason, right? And what I'm not saying be irrational. What I'm saying is like there's something to be said when you're emotionally invested or charged into something. And I mean, that's a whole area of psychology that's under study and outside of the scope of this conversation. But I think about the number of guests that I've had that have like a compelling story, and one that comes to mind is Lisa Salzberg. And she is I believe she's the founder and president of the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association. And she was, she was, I suppose, I can't remember what she was doing before. It was really more kind of administrative, I think somewhat connected to health, but not to such a level of detail as she pioneers today. And what I mean is a detail of understanding, like firsthand experientially, what it means to have that disease and to lose family members and to have actually had a heart transplant through it. And the odyssey that is the diagnostic odyssey, let's say, of the members that she, works to educate today. Because so this is my, call it, vice of old, like as a, scientist. It's like, I really think it's cool just to understand, right? Taken to its extreme, it's like, wow, wouldn't it be cool to split the atom? And it's like, well, but for what?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, and I think that there becomes a moment in a, a scientist's career where I think they do get, charged or activated by something, hopefully to do good. And so, yeah, I mean, I see that, over and over again, in particular in the rare disease world, because there's so that subset of individuals in those rare disease are often misunderstood or unheard. These people who against all odds are pursuing, the endeavor to come to a cure. And so what's that been like? So your daughter's 19 when you found out that she had type 1 diabetes, she was obviously very young, like infant, probably.
She was 3 years old.
3 years old. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And maybe you could tell me a little bit about that journey, like how here you are, this like, brilliant scientist, and you have this thing that you maybe understand but can't do anything about. Like, what does that feel like?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that experience was very surreal for me. The situation where, I felt like as a scientist, I should have seen the signs. I should have been able to identify, what was going on. And we really didn't have any clue. My daughter wasn't feeling well. She'd been fairly lethargic, and we just knew something wasn't right. And so we, took her in to be seen, and, subsequently got some test results that indicated that she had type 1 diabetes, and it just started to click. It was like, oh yeah, all of these symptoms that we've been observing make sense. And, I think an interesting experience, as a scientist and as a father. I spent so much time as a scientist, in the details, but applying those details to the world around me, I
Right.
strive to do, as you kind of indicated, kind of make a difference, but sometimes can't even see, immediately where that intersects, and how that applies to what we're doing in our day to day.
Yeah. And it's humbling too. I think when you become a parent, like I was in the emergency room 2 weeks ago because, well, surprise, surprise, our daughter put a bead up her nose. And you're like, yeah, like that's what 2-year-olds do. Like, why were we letting her play with beads? And but even just the processes to like expel it, and it kind of took me back to my like lifeguarding days, where I remember when I got that job as a lifeguard, and there was actually a drowning off site, like not at my beach in Toronto. But I remember getting there, and I was the one as first responder, pulled him out and resuscitated him. Unfortunately, he died on the way to the hospital. But I just remember thinking like, wow, there's like a lot of responsibility that I'm really ill prepared for. And so on the one hand, I was like, how do I over prepare? Because I'd rather be over
Mhm.
prepared. I had this whole thing like lifeguard team. And so you just did these intensive situations that would never happen, but now you feel prepared. But the thing that I learned as I was doing it is like, well, hey, you're never going to be alone when you're doing this. And so like, what's the care team, right?
Mhm.
That is, essentially supporting you through the process of urgent care. And as it turns out, this research and development process is, you're not as much as we were kind of trained that way, like academically in our little kind of silos, or like, I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of time in the dark room doing Western blots at like 3 a.m. And it's like, okay, cool, there are the results, but then there's the knowledge translation that requires this whole team. And this is one of the things we were talking about at the beginning, is as I approach episode 100, it's like, wow, here are all these really great people doing amazing things, working, kind of touching the elephant blindfolded, but all kind of working on the similar, problem of, let's say, proactive preventative care, cures. And there's this technology that can really, connect people now like never before. But it just kind of question comes to me. It's like, what if we were all in the same room more often, with the customer or the patient, like right in front of us? And that's not the way that science is done normally either, right? It's like, where you get to be objective, and even as you think about your experiences in ER, for example, the doctors really, they don't include the patient in the conversation because I think there's fear that they may not understand, or it would be irresponsible or malpractice. But I think that's changing, right? And so I'll say one more thing, and then what I really want to understand is like how you went from that kind of energy, emotion into the career that you're now spearheading, and the initiatives that you're spearheading at the Mayo Clinic. So in particular, I think you have some therapeutics that are in trials with Vertex, for example, according to my notes last time. Even just the fact that you're creating complete islets, not just beta cells, right? And they're actually, we're actually at a stage where you might regenerate those islet cells and have endogenous insulin again. I think is where you're going, but I'm not expert here. But I guess the frame that I was coming to, it's kind of more of a question we can revisit later, is the very nature at which we're doing science changing, right? Like, because there's the opportunity now for citizen scientists to take control of data, because the complexity of biology is, look, it's not physics, it's not basic science, it's like actual complexity that requires a much more iterative cycle and let's say appreciation for the scientific method in and of itself. As really, it's like, these are theories that we want to ruthlessly try to disprove, rather than we want this thing here forever as the final therapy. And I think we can only do that if we allow more and more individuals to come to the table. So anyway, that's my kind of radical thing that we can revisit later, but I do want to get to like how this went from motivation to do the work to the actual like really cool intervention that is going on in your lab at the Mayo Clinic.
Yeah. So many, important points there that I think are great to touch on. I think from a personal standpoint, I've told you a little bit about how this kind of came about in my life, but none of us work in a vacuum or live in a vacuum. And really like even just the decision for me to kind of move in this space, was impacted by those around us. As I kind of indicated, I as a scientist, I knew some about diabetes, but it wasn't my area of research at the time. I was in cancer drug discovery, and you know, I felt like I was kind of playing catch up at that point of saying, okay, this is an area that I need to understand and I want to understand. And, I relied on other people. Actually, one of your former guests, Neil Kitchen, who was at the same university as I was as a graduate student, I ran into him one day and was telling him about my daughter. And he had a family member who had type 1 diabetes. And he's the one who kind of pointed me towards Doug Melton and, hey, maybe this is somewhere where you should consider, going to do your postdoctoral studies. And so I think that, none of us can do this alone. And that's a very simple example of that, of how, working together, we can actually, really come to the best solutions of how we move forward. But I do think, as you indicate, that the way we do science is changing, right? So, for me, this, started as a personal passion that I have, and, needed to develop some scientific skills to be able to do that. But that passion has also provided me some significant advantages as I think about how I approach my science, right? So, when I am thinking about what we might be doing in the lab, I'm routinely thinking about, well, how might this impact my children? We can get into some of the more details, but you indicated it, that one of the things that we're working on is developing some cell therapies that would, be, an opportunity for patients that if they received the cell therapy, that they would, have the ability to produce their own insulin. They wouldn't need to have insulin injections. They wouldn't need to be checking their blood. But there is also some unknowns and some uncertainties around that. And so, balancing that from a standpoint of not just I'm a scientist and I'm doing this because it's interesting, but I'm a scientist who wants to do something that's actually going to impact patients' lives. And I know some of these patients. How would I feel about utilizing this strategy in my children? And that really colors, I think, the way that I think about my science, the way that we approach our science. And I think it really, points to this other aspect as well, that's just my own personal experience, but that's the way that things are moving in the scientific fields. I work fairly closely with a funding organization called Breakthrough T1D. They're not only a funding organization, but they're an advocacy organization, but they fund a lot of research in this space. And one of the really kind of, I think, key points that they have begun to introduce into the way that they fund research is that they expect for researchers to involve patients and public in the research. So this patient and public involvement and engagement is becoming a key component of those grants. So you're not only applying to receive funds to do the bench research, but you also have to describe the plans of how you are going to involve the public and patients and receive that perspective and utilize that perspective in how you design the direction and the work that you're doing from a scientific standpoint. And so I think this is beginning to change in the way that we start thinking about how research is being pursued. Not entirely is that being done across all disciplines, but I think we're starting to see some momentum in that space. And I think that's going to be really impactful as we move forward with this kind of strategy or this kind of model.
This might be outside of your purview, but I had a guest, Gerald Jackson. So Gerald Jackson is more in like kind of tech innovation. So this is more kind of a question for him probably, but you might be aware of it. Is there a future where, because one of the biggest barriers to, any kind of, research advancement or clinical validation, has to do with the access to patient records and access to clinical data and subclinical data in a way. It's like you actually kind of want to see how the human behaves in the wild, because I've learned that from working with athletes. It's like if you treat an athlete in the physio clinic versus on the track, it's just very different assessment that you would be able to conduct, or you would be able to discern from, as I said, seeing the athlete, seeing the human in the wild. And so when it comes to, technology and things like wearable tech and things like, access to digital records, things like DNA, things like bloods, this notion of a digital twin, if you will. Do
Mhm.
you see a future where, or is it already happening? Because the other thing about the kind of clinical trials is you need the super healthy normal controls also as kind of a backdrop of comparison. So is there a future where it will become a lot easier for people to opt in and participate just because of different technologies that could be available just as a proactive wellness solution? Like I know, for example, like Tempest AI is, they have an app called Olivia, I think it is. And, essentially the subject is engaging with this app, but as they do, they're adding their visit transcripts with the doc, they're adding their medical records and all those records, like this massive data, billions of data points, they're, as I say, their digital twin plus their genome, that's now all shareable. And so, is there a future where participation becomes easier and in the long run cheaper because we can leverage this technology? Because the efficacy is a challenge, right? It's like you have
Mhm.
patients sign up, but 70% compliance is good, so yeah, I'd love to understand, like you being associated with the Mayo Clinic. Are you a part of that? Are you hearing whispers of that, or is that kind of really outside of your purview?
Yeah. Wonderful question.
Easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very important area, and it's an area where there's a lot of growth and development in a lot of different aspects. And I think you've hit on some really interesting points here. One of them is the idea of, like you talked about, we need to have the super healthy controls, and what is that? What does that even mean? What is healthy, right? Like, and for
Mhm.
many instances, when we're incorporating, what we call a healthy control, just means that it doesn't have the particular disease or the particular trait that we're actually looking at, but we're not looking at the whole, individual or the whole organism, right? And so I think that that's an area where there is starting to be, growing appreciation, but also the aspects that you talk about the tremendous amount of data that we have, right? And this data is typically siloed into these, different organizations and institutions. And so finding ways to be able to share that data and to be able to capitalize on that data has been a really growing area in this field. And I think that there are efforts both at Mayo Clinic and at other institutions to really be able to capitalize on this opportunity to be able to really advance significant, take significant steps towards, addressing disease in a different way. And part of that effort involves kind of breaking down some of those barriers, right? It an opportunity for us to be able to not have this data just siloed into these different institutions, but how it can be shared while still protecting, privacy, patient privacy, and other important aspects, but the ability to still be able to utilize that data and not be locked away in different places. And so there's I can identify a number of different initiatives in this space, including, utilizing AI and machine learning and really increasing that for diagnostics, for the way that we, evaluate medical imaging, for the way that we think about large data sets of patient data and identify trends that had not been previously appreciated. And so I do think that you're right. It's not just about patient engagement in terms of, having a patient perspective, but it's also how do we actually capitalize on all of this data? We now live in a world where the data is recorded. We don't have all of these medical records just on papers and filing cabinets somewhere, but we have digital records that really allow us to start thinking about how we can use this as a resource, a research resource that's going to allow us to really advance where things are going.
So what is a day in the life of, Dr. Quinn Peterson today in terms of, like we were talking, and I think you mentioned you have some like application deadlines, you probably have conferences, and because there's a lot more to, the research than just the lab work, right? So, what does that look like currently? Which location are you at in which Mayo?
I'm in Rochester, Minnesota. Mayo Clinic is a 3 campus institution, and really I have a lot of interactions actually with folks on the other campuses as well. But the largest campus is in Rochester, Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, what is a day in the life of in Rochester, in Minnesota?
So I think my days are filled with a variety of different activities, right? I spend a lot of time working with the folks in my lab. So I have a team of 9 people that work in my lab, between graduate students, postdocs, career scientists, that are, helping to advance this work forward. And so, typical day would involve meeting with individuals from my lab, reviewing the data, brainstorming about, what the interpretation of that data is and what additional pieces of evidence we need to really kind of understand that, and where we're going from here. What's the next thing that we need to do? So I just before this, I got out of a lab meeting with my entire lab, and we spent, much of the time thinking about, what we actually think is what we think is going on within the islet in a pancreas, and how can we actually think about looking at cell-cell contact and new avenues for how we might explore that area of understanding the communication between these different cells. And so, I think that's what I find is, one of the most, gratifying parts of my job. But as you noted, there are many other aspects. We can't do this work without funding. And so, we often talk about, science, and maybe specifically academic science, as being, something where we can do whatever we want to do. We have complete autonomy, and that's not entirely true. We need to, we still need funding for the work that we do, which means that we need to be working on something that's meaningful to other people as well. It can't just be meaningful to me, but it needs to be meaningful to other people as well. And so spend a fair amount of time involved in, thinking about, how can we, not only write grants to get resources to allow us to do the work, but also thinking about, well, how do we interact with other scientists and physicians in this space to really kind of work together to understand what are the critical pieces that haven't been answered that we need to kind of step forward with. Where can we actually, place what we're trying to do within the broader context of the trajectory of science, and how are we going to make a specific impact in that space?
I as you're talking, there a lot of threads I'd like to pull on there, but there's one that kind of just resurfaced that I was thinking before we connected that I wanted to ask you is, there's a lot of there's been a massive evolution, obviously, in like the the digital technology, like the workflows. I think that AI has been probably rapidly advancing for you. Interested to know, like, what about on the wet lab side? Like, so that's the dry lab side. What about on the wet lab side? Like, have you seen anything there on the bench that you're particularly excited about? Like, you mentioned, Kitchen, like he's at Zymo Research, like they've got a lot of really, cool things that they're doing on the life science side of things for researchers. Like, what does that look like?
We started to incorporate not only genomics and, the ability to do single cell genomics, but now we have spatial transcriptomics, which is starting to allow us to, to understand not only what's going on with cells, but how are they interacting with each other. And I think these technologies really are advancing the way that we do science in the lab. And they're also, in a fascinating way, starting to provide capability to revisit work that has been done previously with new approaches, new techniques, and new ability to gain additional insights. I think the technological advances are critically important to the work that we're doing in the lab. But when you think about regeneration as a whole, some of the most classical models of regeneration have been known for decades, right? We think about the axolotl, this, Mexican salamander, which has the ability to regenerate an entire limb, including the bones and all of the nervous structure, et cetera. Or we think about, maybe a new model that's, starting to be appreciated, a spiny mouse, where, we have actual organs that, appear to be able to regenerate in these animals. And so some of these models that have been around for a long time, we're now having tools to be able to come back and look at those models with these, new eyes, and to be able to gain new insights. And so I think that specifically when we're talking about, regeneration research, we start thinking about this kind of in this 2 ways, right? Of the kind of the new and the old blended together, and that really providing opportunities to explore, really fascinating new ideas that are going to, make not just incremental, but significant advances as we move forward. So I do think that there's, a lot that's changing. If I were to, step back just a little bit and think about how, what we're doing in the bench is changing, I might also talk a little bit about, kind of the motivation. I think there's been a progression in motivation, right? As we, think back over time, and if we want to kind of restrict what we're talking about to, medical interventions, right? I think when, originally a lot of the thought process was around, okay, I have a particular defect in, an individual, in a cell, in a protein, and I'm going to look for a drug, for a therapy, but a drug that is going to, target that defect, right? And so maybe I find a drug, a chemical that's going to be able to, bind to that particular defective protein and might be able to fix the defect, right? And that was kind of the initial mode here is let's try and correct the defect. And then, we kind of had a lot of success in that area. Many of the drugs that are being utilized are successful in that area. But then, there are a number of health challenges that are actually the result of not just a, defective protein, but a missing protein entirely. So now we start thinking about, well, okay, well, how do we actually now create drugs that are not just trying to fix something, but are actually trying to replace something? And, I think that then has even, expanded and largely touches on kind of the work that I do, where it's not just a particular protein that's missing, but in type 1 diabetes, it's an entire cell that's missing. There are no beta cells in these individuals. So now how do we actually think about creating a therapy that's going to replace an entire cell? And so, that's been a fascinating trajectory, but that trajectory doesn't actually end there, because really I think the way that we're going is towards thinking about this regeneration, not only in replacement, but also being able to rejuvenate existing tissues to be able to prevent disease. The ultimate cure is the prevention of that disease. And so I think that we're starting to see, this long arc history of medical advancement as we're now bringing these technologies that allow us to start, exploring things in different ways and answering different questions, not being restricted to kind of the earlier modes of intervention that we thought about.
What was it called? It was the paradigm associated with the discovery. I think it was the synthesis. It was the evolutionary synthesis age, right?
Mm.
It's like, are we at a moment here where we have like a molecular biology synthesis happening, so that this future that you're talking about, which is it's not curing disease anymore, now it's preventing them from happening? Because the synthesis is like wet lab plus dry lab stacks, right? Because single cell DNA, guess what? Your genomes are in theory different in every single cell. They certainly are at the level of expression, right? And so once we kind of have a map in that way, and that's the really cool thing, is that we're always operating off a map, right? And we never want to confuse the map as the terrain or the landscape. So that's kind of me playing back to you, the parallel or the paradigm shifting moment here, where we have at this possibility for this confluence of wet lab and dry lab stack. So that's really particularly exciting for me. Maybe the three things that we want to get people at the end of this. So like number one is, what did we really talk about here? What was the big idea that we can share with the world who doesn't necessarily get access to people like you every day? Number two, like who needs to hear it? And then number three, who would you recommend as my next guest?
Yeah, that's great. I think really what we, really, if you boil it down, what we're talking about is really about how the way that we think about science and the way that we perform science has changed and perhaps is in the process of this evolution, right? We talked about how, different new technologies intersect with old technologies, how we actually really kind of bring science to the next level. And again, a big part of that involves also kind of bringing the human element into it, right? Not having everyone just kind of off in their own individual corners working on science, but working together, bringing in patients, bringing in physicians, bringing in scientists, bringing in the public, right? And I think all of this is really describing, a nexus point in the way that we think about science. And for me, it's exciting, right? It's exciting to think about where we're going and how we're going to be able to really, as we talked a little bit about, not just do science just because it's fun, right? Like that's maybe why I got into science, is to have some fun because I thought it was interesting, but not just do it because it's fun, but do it because it's something that can impact the world. And I think that that's, really, I think what we're talking about is how do we best impact the world? How do we utilize these technologies that we have, these people that we have, these resources that we have to be able to best impact the world around us? So I think that, who needs to hear this? Well, I think that, I could answer that in so many different ways. Obviously, in terms of the specifics of what I'm doing, everyone's touched by diabetes, right? Like, there's probably not a person in the world who doesn't, know someone who has diabetes, whether that be type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, but it impacts all of us. But on a broader sense, really this kind of evolution of science and the necessity of kind of making sure that our science is actually going somewhere means that everyone needs to know about this, right? Like, we need to be thinking as a society about how we're going to think about science, how we're going to do science, and what the involvement of everyone is in that, right? We can't live in a world anymore where individuals just trust the scientists to go do things. Not that scientists aren't trustworthy. I think that scientists are incredibly trustworthy, but we need to make sure that everyone's part of the mission, everyone's part of the team, and that we're trying to solve these problems together. And I think that's something that's been missing in recent years, is that connection. And I'm grateful for opportunities and initiatives that are starting to bring, different groups together to be able to work on this together. So I think we've got a lot of exciting things ahead of us. We've got a lot of challenges to face, but if we face them together, I think we're going to be able to do great things.
Amazing.
I would recommend Ben Bikman. Do you know Ben Bikman?
No, I don't know Ben.
So Ben Bikman is it kind of floats in my world because he really thinks about metabolism, right? As it relates to diabetes, but more broadly, right? He thinks about the endocrine system and metabolism. He, has, maybe someone that would be nice, Jeremy, for you to kind of connect with regardless. He's got some amount of online presence and you can kind of go look at that. But Ben's someone that I've, enjoyed hearing from his insights into endocrinology and metabolism, how we think about, integrating not just, we've talked a lot today about integrating, people, technologies, et cetera. But, I think that Ben really spent a lot of time thinking about how do we integrate different aspects of biology, of human biology together, right? So we're not just thinking about obesity, and we're not just thinking about, muscle loss, but we're thinking about how all of these different, systems work together and how we can think about really improving health through understanding the interplay between these different systems.
Amazing. Okay, well, I'll reach out with you to get connected and to certainly extend the invitation to Ben. I welcome his perspectives on the show. But Quinn, I want to thank you so much for taking the time today, not just for today, but thanking you for everything that you've done, that you're doing, that you will do. It's been my absolute pleasure here today, and like I say, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Science is at its best when it is collaborative, iterative, and deeply personal. Dr. Peterson's work reminds us that innovation isn't just about molecules, it's about the motivation to restore latent biological capacity. We are moving beyond fixing deficits and toward rejuvenating systems and preventing disease entirely. As we discussed, the hardest work of all is making something simple, distilling complex biology into a functional cure. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of the DNA of Things. If this conversation resonated with you, I invite you to share it with someone who you think it would help. Thanks again. I'm Dr. Jeremy Koenig. Stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next episode.